This is a follow-up to my Kunai video. Watch that one first, please.
Hello again. Originally I didn't plan on making a follow-up video, but I got a lot of good feedback and comments from the last video. The editing will be a bit more lax here, since I'd like to get this out while that video is still relevant. Strike while the iron is hot, you know. One big misconception I've seen from both those who support and don't support me is that I just want to nerf the kunai. I never said it was overpowered, it's just unbalanced in a way where it feeds off bad players that's really annoying for any of the good ones trying to deal with the spy, while being bad in teams of good players. If you want more elaborate detail on how it sucks in Highlander like I said, CyberWizard made a good video explaining this. I don't actually hate the kunai. Like I said, I used to actually defend it. Here is straight up evidence of me doing that, having only just learnt that people consider it overpowered. Look at that spy main bias. But my problems have always stemmed from the Dead Ringer, and I've always considered that the main problem. If I had to sacrifice only one of the two, it would be the Ringer, though I understand that's the unpopular opinion. My video was more so coming to an understanding of why people dislike the kunai, even if I don't. And it's a tricky situation on both sides, because the people who use it a lot have all this tech around it and are very attached to it. But then you have the other group that are sick of fighting it and don't care about the tech, creating a very us versus them scenario. There was also some good points brought up in my Discord about how the kunai is good for not being reliant on health packs, and how it's really good in man versus machine. Back on the topic of the Dead Ringer, Uncle Dane somewhat disagreed with my video on that weapon, and considered the kunai to be the bigger issue, and that came up in the podcast we did a month back, where he reckoned that if the kunai was dealt with, my problems with the Dead Ringer would probably vanish. I wasn't that on board until he said one specific thing.
Spy, I think, should be the character that chooses high priority targets to get stabs. But with the kunai, you actually are choosing low priority targets in order to get stabs.
Just so you have health, yeah. And that simple phrase changed my perspective. It made me think more about how the problems with the kunai extend beyond the Dead Ringer. Unlike my Dead Ringer video, I proposed changes for the kunai in that same video because I just wanted this to be a one and done ordeal. However, in retrospect, I should have just done that again for the kunai because it creates a lot of interesting discussion. The main point of criticism for my recent kunai video is that the proposed change of removing the knife for 10 seconds was too harsh. And before you think, oh no, they're just angry spy mains who can't play with the kunai for their frag movies and they're just angry at Jonto who is always right and they probably into abuse or cheat. No! This is not that. These are legitimate criticisms. I stand by pretty much everything else I said in the video, but in terms of the proposed changes, I'll happily take the L on that if it means we get to learn things from it, because my word is not gospel. So here, I'm going to share a bunch of my other rebalance ideas, and a few from some other people as well. But instead of showing full stat cards, I'm going to just show a bunch of individual buffs and nerfs that could be used interchangeably to try and address the problem. When actually combining the stats, the main criteria I have for making it work is to 1. Not be able to invalidate its own downsides, 2. Not be too good at feeding off bad teammates, and 3. Keep you alive after a kill. The reasoning behind the whole 10 seconds of no knife thing was a result of criteria 1. Even if the max health penalty is being invalidated somewhat, the other persistent downside is there to make up for it, and it also ties into criteria 2. Not saying my reasoning of 10 whole seconds was perfect, but hopefully the basis of that idea makes sense. Anyway, let's start with some proposed nerfs. First, of course, we have my nerf from the video. Though the timer doesn't need to be 10 whole seconds, that could totally be reduced. Many people also suggested that the healing effect could go on a cooldown instead of the knife itself, which was one of my concepts, and while I like it, it does potentially run into the problem of criteria 1, meaning it should be paired with another persistent downside. Another idea is to make the healing apply over time instead of instantly, which again is a criteria 1 problem, but it would significantly help with making tanking damage between stabs being risky, so it's still a decent idea. Now, coming to ideas for persistent downsides, I have a few. The first is a 7% move speed penalty. It's not a huge amount, but this essentially reverts him back to the pre-meet your match state where he was the same speed as Pyro, Engineer, and Sniper. Yeah, Spy used to be slower. This would mean that outrunning players would be harder since you're no longer one of the fastest classes in the game, but not be annoyingly slow. Second is to take the 33% cloak drain rate from the Your Eternal Reward and give it to the kunai instead, which I honestly think would fit the kunai better than on the Year, which is a weapon I really like actually. Actually, I'll make a video about it eventually, okay? My third idea for a persistent downside is no damage resistance from Cloak. This would mean the 20% resistance from stock and Cloak and Dagger, but yes, this is very much targeted at the Dead Ringer synergy, not gonna lie. Since those two things combined allow the Spy to be annoyingly tanky. Though I will say, this wouldn't invalidate the speed boost the Ringer can give you, meaning while it can't be used for damage tanking, it can still be used for speed manipulation for trick stabs, which I think is totally fine. Now, say combine a persistent downside like these with the healing being on a cooldown, this means you could still chain stab, but at greater risk if you overextend. But if you get a kill and get away with that without taking damage, you can carry that health into your next attack. Now, those are my ideas for nerfs, but here's also some ideas for buffs, which are here to not only offset potential nerfs, but to also help its effectiveness in higher skilled lobbies. First off, we of course have the two from my original video, the 100 base health and the 210 guarantee instead of it scaling with the health of the victim. And honestly, that second one should just be there, not gonna lie. Next was a really interesting idea from a comment, where instead of just clearing debuffs on stab, you actually become immune to them for the next 2 to 3 seconds afterwards, which is actually a really interesting idea. Another buff idea that comes from CyberWizard is to remove the overheal decay entirely, which I really like because combined with a persistent downside, it could be a way of rewarding you for not taking damage since you actually get to keep the health long term. Now, this last buff idea is entirely mine, and it's really goofy, and in some ways it's both a buff and a nerf, but I'm glad this video gives me an excuse to share it. Bear with me on this one. Upon backstab, you emit a loud, non-damaging shockwave that knocks any nearby players away from you. Think of it like a 360-degree air blast with a bit more oomph. This is potentially a downside in being able to mess up chain stabs, but an upside in the fact it displaces enemies who could potentially try to kill you, and put them out of position for your teammates to benefit. And yes, if you knocked someone off of a cliff, you would get kill credit. It's goofy and dumb and all that, but I had to share this idea. Now, with these buffs and nerfs in mind, you could essentially take some of them and combine them together in ways that could help the weapon while not entirely invalidating its value. It's a constructive way of addressing these problems. There's interesting things you could do with these ideas or contribute some of your own. Understanding game balance and design is about seeing things from the perspectives of all parties involved, not just the one you find to be your favorite. Because if Gaben acted like that around his favorite class, you could imagine how awful that would be. Now, this is where the video was originally going to end, but in the middle of putting this one together, this guy from earlier put out an entire response video. In that video, they ended up proposing their own rework idea for the kunai. And hey, look at that, it literally fulfills all 3 criteria I mentioned earlier. They understood the issues I explained with the kunai and where I think it went wrong, but they disagreed with my rebalance and gave their own, well, constructive criticism. The whole video was really well thought out and put together, and I don't really see any point in arguing with the video when I just straight up agree with the whole thing. If you want to learn more about the reasoning behind their proposed rework, their video is the first link in the description. It's just good. I have no further comment. Okay, bye. I'm finally done talking about this weapon. Can I move on now, please?